In the winter of 1778, a militia officer named Daniel Morgan stood in the freezing mud of South Carolina with exactly one thing no American general had yet possessed: absolute certainty that his ragtag army of farmers, shopkeepers, and frontier riflemen could destroy the finest infantry regiment the British Empire had ever fielded. Not because he believed in some noble cause, not because he was born to command, but because he understood something that every aristocratic officer in the Continental Army had missed entirely. The common soldier was far more dangerous when he was treated like he was capable of thinking. This is the story they never taught you in school. Not about the brilliant tactical genius, though Morgan was exactly that. Not about the flawless battle plan, though what he pulled off at Cowpens in January 1781 still stands as one of the most perfectly executed engagements in American military history. No, this is about something far more subversive, far more American, and far more dangerous to the old order than any musket ball. It's the story of how a man with no formal training, no aristocratic pedigree, and no patience for the rules that govern military hierarchy decided that an army of commoners could win by refusing to fight like commoners were supposed to fight. And that decision, that single, radical choice to trust his men with something commanders never trusted ordinary soldiers with, broke an entire system. Daniel Morgan was born poor. His father was a Welsh immigrant with nothing but a surname and a willingness to work. His mother was of mixed Welsh and German stock. There was no fortune coming, no land grant, no connections to power. Morgan was supposed to end up like 10,000 other poor boys in colonial America, a laborer, a tenant, maybe a shopkeeper if luck fell his way. Instead, he became something the Continental Army desperately needed but could never figure out how to create: a commander who understood that discipline didn't require obedience, and obedience didn't require the fiction that commoners were somehow lesser. Morgan grew up on that frontier, that brutal, chaotic space between civilization and wilderness where you didn't survive by following someone else's rules. You survived by understanding the rules of your environment. You survived by improvisation. You survived by asking questions when something didn't make sense. And those lessons, forged in the backwoods of North Carolina, would eventually reshape how American warfare itself was understood. When Morgan joined the army, first as a teamster hauling supplies for the British during the French and Indian War, and then later as a soldier, he carried those frontier lessons with him like weapons. The army of his day was built on a single assumption, that common soldiers were essentially equipment. You pointed them in a direction, you ordered them to march in a straight line, you commanded them to fire in synchronized volleys. Their job was obedience, their virtue was submissiveness. Initiative was dangerous, thought was a liability. An officer commanded, a soldier obeyed. That was the natural order, not just in the British Army, but in every army in Europe. But Morgan had seen something in those frontier conflicts that most trained officers missed. The men who fought as individuals, who understood what they were doing and why, who were trusted to make decisions about when to shoot and where to aim, were devastatingly effective, especially when they faced enemies who didn't expect that kind of warfare. So when Morgan took command of the Southern Department in 1780, when he was given thousands of exhausted, demoralized, undertrained militia and regulars, he didn't try to turn them into redcoats. He did something radical. He asked them what they could actually do, and then he built his entire strategy around what American soldiers could do better than British soldiers. By the time Banastre Tarleton, the ruthless British cavalry commander, came looking for Morgan in the winter of 1781, Morgan had already started planning something that would seem insane to anyone trained in European warfare. Tarleton was a legend in his own time. Undefeated cavalry officer, feared throughout the South for his speed and brutality. He had destroyed the American militia in battle after battle. Tarleton believed, as most British officers believed, that the American militia were simply cowards in civilian clothes. That the correct answer to a militia army was to attack them hard and fast before they could run away. Morgan let Tarleton come. He even wrote to friends that he wasn't afraid, that Tarleton was about to discover that American soldiers, when properly led and properly trusted, were something different entirely. The tactical details of Cowpens are well documented. What isn't talked about nearly enough is the revolutionary thing Morgan did before he ever fired a shot. He told his men the truth. He didn't lie to them about the odds. He didn't tell them they were fighting for liberty or glory or anything abstract. He told them that the British were expecting them to break and run. He told them that Tarleton had made a career of defeating militia because militia usually did exactly what the British expected. Then, and this is crucial, he gave them a choice about how to fight. The militia would form the front line. They would fire 2 volleys at British regulars advancing toward them. Then they would retreat to the second line, not in panic, not in rout, deliberately, because Morgan understood that militia could do one thing better than regular infantry. They could conduct a fighting retreat that looked like chaos but was actually perfectly controlled. The British regulars would chase them, thinking they'd won. But as they advanced, They would run directly into the full disciplined force of Morgan's Continental regulars. Fresh, undamaged, waiting. The retreat wasn't cowardice. It was a trap. And it worked because Morgan trusted his men enough to explain it. This was heretical in 1781. Officers were supposed to command. Men were supposed to obey without understanding. The entire military theory of the age was built on the assumption that common soldiers couldn't be trusted with information, that strategy was an aristocratic privilege, that explaining things to ordinary men was beneath an officer's dignity. Morgan did the exact opposite. He explained everything. He talked about what the British would do, how they would think, why their expectations would become their weakness. He made his men partners in the strategy instead of passive instruments of it. And when those men walked into the Battle of Cowpens the next morning, they weren't desperate militia hoping not to die. They weren't peasants sent to die by aristocratic commanders who didn't care whether they lived. They were soldiers who understood what they were about to do and believed it could work, which, as it turned out, made all the difference. The battle lasted less than an hour. Tarleton's cavalry was routed. His infantry was broken. His legend was shattered. Most importantly, the mythology of European military dominance in North America was shattered with it. But here's what nobody tells you about what happened next. Morgan didn't become a household name. He didn't become a romantic figure in American patriotic mythology. He went home to South Carolina after the war, lived quietly, and spent most of his later life dealing with health problems and financial struggles. History forgot him almost entirely. The man who fundamentally changed how American soldiers could be led, by treating them as thinking beings capable of understanding strategy instead of automata designed for blind obedience, faded into obscurity while Washington got monuments and Franklin got fame. That's the real story, not some triumphant narrative about genius changing the course of history, but something more interesting about a man who understood something fundamental about American soldiers, that they were different from European soldiers precisely because they came from a culture that valued individual judgment, and who understood that the path to military effectiveness in America wasn't to suppress that difference, but to weaponize it. Morgan's real innovation wasn't tactical. Tactical innovations fade. What fades slower is understanding about how to lead men. And Morgan understood something that would echo through American military history, that soldiers trained to think are more dangerous than soldiers trained to obey. Every commander after Morgan who understood this principle, who trusted his soldiers enough to explain the plan instead of just order it executed, had better results. And every commander who forgot it paid the price. This pattern wasn't accidental. It was baked into what America was becoming. A nation built on the idea that ordinary people were capable of making their own decisions couldn't indefinitely maintain armies built on the opposite principle. The contradiction was too obvious. The gap between civilian culture and military culture too stark. Morgan didn't know he was participating in a revolution of military culture. He was just a practical man solving the problem in front of him, how to win with the men he had, using the strengths they actually possessed. But in solving that problem, he created a template, a way of thinking about American soldiers that would outlast every tactical lesson, every formation, every weapon system. The guide to Morgan's complete military life and the real strategic innovations at Cowpens, the ones that changed everything about how American armies could operate, that's available in the description and the pinned comment if you want to go much deeper into how this one man's understanding of his own soldiers rewrote the rules of warfare. What's remarkable is how completely this understanding was suppressed and then recovered. During the Civil War, 100 years later, American commanders had largely forgotten Morgan's lesson. They fought like Europeans, in rigid formations, and Americans died by the hundreds of thousands as a result. But by World War I, by World War II, that understanding had clawed its way back. American soldiers were trained differently. They were given more latitude. They were expected to think, and it made them more effective. The irony is profound. Morgan lived in a world that believed hierarchical discipline was the highest military virtue. He was surrounded by officers who saw soldiers as equipment. The entire military philosophy of his time told him that treating soldiers like thinking beings was a weakness, an abdication of proper command authority. And yet, he did exactly that, and it worked spectacularly. And when it worked, when his militia held their ground and did exactly what they were supposed to do, not because they feared punishment, but because they understood the plan and believed in it, that success was radical. It suggested something dangerous to the ruling military establishment, that the entire edifice of military discipline built on fear and hierarchy might be unnecessary. That trust might be more powerful than terror. We don't often think about Cowpens as a revolutionary moment in military culture. We remember it as a brilliant tactical victory. We praise Morgan's genius. We note his understanding of the ground and his use of militia and his knowledge of how to combine different types of troops. All true. But the real revolution, the one that actually changed everything, was quieter. It was a commander, telling ordinary soldiers the truth and treating them as capable of understanding strategy. Morgan understood his soldiers. He understood that they were farmers and frontiermen accustomed to making their own decisions. He understood that they could handle being told the truth far better than they could handle being treated as mindless equipment. He understood that the best way to command American soldiers was not to command them at all, but to explain what needed to happen and trust them to make it happen. That understanding didn't come from military academy training. It came from living as a frontier man where hierarchy was natural but not absolute, where everyone had to pull their weight, where initiative and judgment were survival skills. Morgan carried those lessons into the army and applied them at a level nobody expected. What happened at Cowpens wasn't a triumph of European military science. It was the complete inversion of European military science. Morgan won by rejecting the premise that his soldiers had to be treated like subordinate beings, incapable of understanding the battle they were fighting. He won by treating them like Americans, independent, capable, deserving of explanation, rather than just orders. And that's why he matters. Not because he won a battle. Battles are won and lost. But because he proved something that would eventually reshape how America fights, how America leads, and what America expects from its citizens in uniform. But here's where most historians stop. They celebrate the victory. They move on to the next chapter, and they miss the crucial part, what happened after. Because the British didn't accept this. They couldn't. A militia army, largely composed of frontier riflemen and backwoods farmers, had just dismantled one of the finest light cavalry units in the empire. In London, in Charleston, in military circles across the South, there was only one way to interpret what Morgan had done. He had made a fool of British military tradition itself. Cornwallis couldn't let this stand. Morgan had humiliated Tarleton, and by extension, humiliated the entire British Southern strategy. So Cornwallis did what any commander in his position would do. He committed his main army to the pursuit and destruction of Daniel Morgan. He sent nearly his entire force, nearly 4,000 men, chasing Morgan and Greene into North Carolina. He was going to make an example. Well, he was going to erase this upstart militia general from history. And this is where the second act of Morgan's genius begins. See, Morgan understood something about warfare that most men of his era did not. He understood that a battle is not an isolated event. It's a moment in a larger narrative, and once you've changed that narrative, once you've made your enemy believe that he must come after you, that he has no choice, you've seized control of the entire campaign. Cornwallis marched north because he believed he had to. Because Morgan had made it unavoidable. And in marching north, with his entire army stretched out in pursuit, Cornwallis was abandoning his secure positions, his supply lines, his fortifications. He was fighting on Morgan's terms now. He just didn't realize it yet. Morgan began a fighting retreat. Not a panicked flight, a calculated withdrawal. He moved north, staying ahead of Cornwallis, but not so far ahead that the British commander would lose interest. He was drawing Cornwallis like a fisherman reeling in a catch. Every day, the British army grew more exhausted. Every mile north, they grew farther from their supplies. Every engagement, small skirmishes at river crossings and mountain passes, confirmed to Cornwallis that Morgan was within reach, just barely, if he pushed a little harder. This was strategy of the highest order. Not the kind that generals learn in academies, but the kind that comes from understanding human nature, from knowing how your enemy thinks, from having the confidence to know that if you keep your nerve, the math of warfare will eventually work in your favor. And the math did work. By the time Cornwallis reached the Dan River in North Carolina, a critical crossing point, he found that Morgan had already crossed. Cornwallis had to stop. His army needed rest. His supply situation had become precarious. He was now hundreds of miles from his base in Charleston, and his lines of communication were stretched to the breaking point. For the first time in this campaign, Cornwallis faced a choice. He could keep chasing Morgan indefinitely, burning out his army in the process, or he could consolidate, hold what he had, and wait for reinforcements. Neither option was attractive. Both meant admitting that his pursuit had failed. But here's the thing about Cornwallis. He was not a man to admit defeat easily. So he did something that would define the rest of the war in the South. He decided to stop chasing Morgan and instead move toward the coast, toward supplies, toward reinforcements, toward Virginia. He was going to abandon the interior of the Carolinas and consolidate his power along the strategic coastal regions. And in making that decision, he handed the entire Southern strategy back to the Americans on a silver platter. Because Morgan's genius wasn't just that he defeated Tarleton at Cowpens, it was that in defeating Tarleton, he forced Cornwallis to act, and in acting the way he did, in committing his entire army to a pursuit that ultimately failed, Cornwallis revealed the fundamental weakness of the British position in the South. You couldn't hold the interior. You couldn't control a population of armed men who refused to accept your authority. And you couldn't defeat an enemy general who understood that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting, but from making your opponent fight on unfavorable terms. Greene understood this. He had sent Morgan south precisely because he knew that Morgan could accomplish this. And now, with Cornwallis chasing phantoms and exhausting his army, Greene had the freedom to move, to attack smaller British garrisons, to rebuild American strength, to demonstrate to the population of the Carolinas that American power was returning. In the months after Cowpens, Morgan stepped back from active campaigning. Age and illness, the same ailments that had plagued him his entire life, caught up with him. But his work was done. The strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Cornwallis, growing increasingly frustrated with the endless pursuit of an enemy that wouldn't stand and fight in a conventional battle, eventually marched into Virginia. And in Virginia, he would meet his final reckoning at Yorktown, not because of his own decisions, but because he had been pushed there by a general who understood that the best victories are often won before the main battle is even fought. But here's where I want to pause and ask you to think about something deeper, because Morgan's story isn't really about Cowpens. It's not even really about his tactical genius, though he possessed that in abundance. It's about something more fundamental to the American character itself. Morgan was a man who believed that fighting men, ordinary men, men without aristocratic breeding, men who learned their trade on the frontier instead of in an academy, these men deserved to be treated with respect. Deserved to understand why they were fighting, deserved to have their intelligence and their courage recognized. That was revolutionary, not in the way that muskets and cannons are revolutionary, but in the way that ideas are revolutionary. Because once you believe that ordinary men are capable of extraordinary things, that they deserve to be treated like thinking beings capable of understanding the mission, not just following blind orders, you've fundamentally changed what's possible on a battlefield. And that belief, that idea, became central to how America would fight wars for the next 2 centuries. Not because a general said it had to be that way, but because Morgan had proven it worked. Because he had shown that you could take men who had never been in a formal army, who had never drilled on a parade ground, who had never read a military manual, and turn them into soldiers capable of defeating professional European cavalry. That was the real victory at Cowpens. Not the tactical maneuver, not the defeat of Tarleton, but the demonstration that the American way of war, built on respect for the individual soldier, on trust, on explanation rather than blind obedience, was not just morally superior. It was militarily superior. And that's why Daniel Morgan matters. That's why his name deserves to be remembered alongside Washington and Greene and the other commanders who shaped the American Revolution. Because he didn't just win battles. He proved something about what Americans could be. He proved that you don't need aristocratic bloodlines to be a great general. You don't need a formal military education. You don't need to come from wealth or privilege. What you need is the courage to trust your men, the intelligence to understand the enemy, and the nerve to bet everything on the idea that ordinary men, treated with dignity and given a mission they understand, are capable of defeating professional armies. That's the inheritance Morgan left us. But here's what most people don't understand about Morgan's legacy. It wasn't just tactical. It wasn't just about how he arranged men on a field or how he read his enemy's movements. The real genius, the thing that made him different from every other commander of his era, was how he fundamentally changed what soldiers believed they were capable of. When Morgan took command of the Southern Army, morale was shattered. The militia had been routed repeatedly. They'd been treated like expendable bodies by commanders who saw them as something less than soldiers. They were farmers, frontiersmen, men who'd left their families to fight for something they barely had words for. And the regular Continental Army, what was left of it, viewed militia with open contempt. Morgan changed that in one simple gesture. He didn't lecture them. He didn't threaten them. He listened to them. Before Cowpens, he walked among his men and explained the battle plan. Not because they needed to understand the strategy in a military sense, but because he believed they deserved to know what they were fighting for and how they would fight it. He told them the militia would fire 2 volleys and fall back, not because they were cowards, but because that was their role. That was their part in the choreography of victory. He told them the regulars would hold the line. He told them cavalry would crush the British flank. And then he said something that officers of his time simply did not say. He said he trusted them. Not as cannon fodder, not as the necessary losses of war, not as bodies to be sacrificed. He said he trusted them to do exactly what he asked, and that when they did, they would defeat the British Army. And because he believed it, truly believed it, they believed it too. That belief changed everything at Cowpens. This is something we've lost in modern discussions about military leadership. We talk about tactics and logistics and strategic doctrine, and those things matter. But what separates a commander who wins from a commander who wins decisively, who breaks the enemy not just militarily but psychologically, is the ability to create a culture where men believe in themselves. Morgan understood that the American soldier, the militia farmer, the frontiersman, the ordinary man called away from his home, fought differently than European soldiers. European soldiers fought because they were ordered to. They fought because their king or their noble demanded it. Their courage was expected. Their obedience was automatic. But the American soldier, he fought because he chose to. He fought because he believed the cause was just, and he could tell immediately if his commander believed in him or viewed him as expendable. Morgan saw this, not as a historian looking back, but as a man who lived it. He'd served in the French and Indian War. He'd been flogged by the British for insubordination, 100 lashes across his back. He knew the European way of warfare intimately, and he understood exactly why it would fail in America. The British expected their soldiers to follow orders without question. The American militia would ask why. The British expected formation discipline to be maintained by fear. The American soldier was motivated by something deeper, by property he owned, by land he worked, by a vision of what he was fighting to build. Fear alone could never control him. Morgan built his entire command philosophy on this foundation. And it's precisely this insight that makes Morgan's story so relevant, even now, centuries later. Because the fundamental truth he uncovered is that ordinary men, when they understand their mission, when they trust their leader, and when they believe that leader respects them as human beings, are capable of extraordinary things. The British at Cowpens fought because they were professional soldiers. They fought because their general ordered them to advance. They fought with courage and discipline. No one questions that. But they fought mechanically. They fought like a force that had been trained to function as a machine. The Americans fought differently. They fought intelligently. They made decisions in real time. They understood what their commander wanted because he'd explained it to them, not commanded it at them. When the militia broke, as planned, they didn't scatter in panic. They regrouped. They supported the next line. They understood their role in the larger choreography. That's not a detail. That's the entire battle. And it's why Morgan's approach to leadership became a model that shaped American military culture for generations afterward. You see echoes of it in the officers who followed, men like Zachary Taylor, who famously trusted his volunteer soldiers at the Battle of Buena Vista and achieved an impossible victory. Men like Ulysses S. Grant, who understood that American soldiers didn't need to be broken like European soldiers, they needed to be given a cause and trusted to see it through. This is the inheritance that's often overlooked when we teach Morgan's story. We remember Cowpens as a tactical masterpiece, and it was, but we forget that the reason the tactics worked was because Morgan had created a command culture that made those tactics possible. Here's another thing that surprises most people. Morgan had almost no formal military training. He wasn't educated at West Point. The academy didn't even exist yet. He'd served in the French and Indian War, but largely as a scout and ranger, not as a trained officer. Most of what he knew about warfare, he learned through experience and through studying the conflicts around him. When the revolution began, he was already in his 40s, old for a soldier in that era. He wasn't a young man driven by idealism or ambition. He was a man with property, with family, with a life already established. He chose to fight because he believed in American independence, and he brought to that fight the accumulated wisdom of decades of life in dangerous conditions. That background made him different from the European officers who sometimes served the Continental Army. Those men had been trained in the formal schools of European warfare. Their assumptions about how war should be fought were deeply ingrained. Morgan, on the other hand, was willing to throw out the rulebook entirely because the American situation demanded it. And that willingness to question conventional wisdom, to look at what worked in practice rather than what theory said should work, is perhaps his greatest gift to the American military tradition. Because America doesn't have the luxury of fighting the way Europe does. America's wars are always wars of choice, fought far from home, requiring soldiers who understand not just how to follow orders but why those orders matter. Morgan grasped this instinctively. His tactics at Cowpens weren't innovations in the sense of being entirely new, but they were innovations in how he applied them to American soldiers fighting American warfare for an American cause. And perhaps most importantly, Morgan proved that greatness in command isn't about where you come from or what schools you attended. It's about your willingness to listen, your ability to see people as they are, not as you've been told they should be, your courage to trust your judgment over established convention. He came from nothing, he became a legend, and he did it by understanding men. Morgan's legacy isn't just that he won a battle, it's that he showed what American leadership could be, not monarchy dressed in military uniform, not European aristocracy transplanted to the New World, but something fundamentally new. Leadership earned through respect. Authority built on trust. Victory achieved by believing in the men under your command. That's worth remembering. That's worth studying. That's worth understanding not just as history, but as a model for how Americans have always been different when they've fought their wars. Because here's what most people miss when they study the Revolutionary War. They focus on the big names, the grand gestures, the speeches that echo through textbooks. But the real revolution, the one that mattered, happened in the hearts of exhausted men who chose to stand their ground because one man believed they could win. Morgan didn't just defeat Tarleton at Cowpens in January 1781. He proved something that changed how Americans would fight wars for the next 2 centuries. He proved that leadership wasn't inherited, it was earned. And that the American soldier, the frontiersman, the militia, the volunteer who left his farm to defend his country could outthink, outfight, and outlast the professional armies of Europe. After Cowpens, Morgan never fought another major battle. His body, ravaged by years of frontier warfare and disease, couldn't sustain the punishment. He retired from active command within months, but the tactical lessons he left behind, the use of terrain, the psychology of retreat, the understanding of militia strengths and weaknesses, became the foundation of American military doctrine. When Ulysses S. Grant fought in the Civil War, he carried Morgan's principles forward. When John J. Pershing commanded in World War I, he understood the value of using terrain and initiative over rigid formation. When George C. Marshall built the army that would win the Second World War, he understood that American soldiers fought differently because they believed differently in their cause. Morgan's influence didn't die with him. It lived in every American commander who understood that you could demand everything from your men if you first showed them you understood them. It lived in every soldier who trusted his leader because that leader trusted him first. But here's what troubles me when I look at Morgan's story today. Most Americans have never heard of him. They know about Washington, rightfully so. They know about Benedict Arnold, about Valley Forge, about the Marquis de Lafayette. But the man who orchestrated one of the most brilliant tactical victories in American history, the commander who proved that an American army didn't need European generals or aristocratic officers to defeat the world's greatest military power, he's been reduced to a footnote. And that's exactly why I've created a comprehensive guide on the underrated commanders of the American Revolution, not just Morgan, but the overlooked tacticians, the frontier fighters, and the unconventional leaders who changed how America fights its wars. This guide goes deep into Morgan's mind, his methods, and the principles he developed that shaped American military strategy for generations. You'll find it in the description and in the pinned comment if you want to go much deeper into his story and understand how he became one of the most influential commanders you've never been taught about in school. Morgan lived to be old, a rarity for Revolutionary War veterans. He lived long enough to see the nation he helped create begin to grow. He lived long enough to know that Cowpens meant something. That the victory had echoed beyond the Carolina frontier, into the halls of British command, into the calculations of Lord Cornwallis, into the understanding that this revolution would not be crushed by superior numbers or better uniforms. He died in 1802, at the age of 66. His funeral was attended by thousands, but within a generation his name began to fade from public memory. The war itself became a story about Washington, about Yorktown, about the Declaration of Independence. Morgan's genius was absorbed into the fabric of American military thought without the man himself being remembered. That's the cost of being a tactical genius in a revolution. You change the course of history, but history forgets to mention your name. Yeah, what makes Morgan's story essential isn't just that he won a battle. It's that he won it the American way, by understanding that the men who fight your wars are not machines. They're individuals. They have fears and strengths. They respond to leadership that respects them. They'll charge into impossible odds if they believe their commander believes in them. And that principle, that understanding of human nature in warfare, that's something every generation of American soldiers has had to relearn. Sometimes we remember it, sometimes we forget it, but it traces back to a backwoods rifleman who never went to a military academy, never learned drill field discipline, never read Clausewitz or Sun Tzu. He learned from life, and he taught by example. If you want to understand not just Morgan, but the entire framework of how underdog commanders changed the course of American history, how they did more with less, how they understood their enemies, how they trusted their men when everything told them to retreat, I've put together a complete ebook guide that covers Morgan, Nathaniel Greene, and 5 other revolutionary commanders whose tactical innovations shaped how America would fight for the next 200 years. You can get that guide from the description or the pinned comment below, and it'll give you the full depth of these stories with battle maps, decision trees, and the actual orders these men gave before their greatest victories. Morgan's story matters because it's not just about one battle in 1781. It's about the principle that leadership in America has always worked differently. It's about understanding that the American soldier, whether he's a colonial militia, a frontiersman, a factory worker called to duty, or a young man drafted into a war halfway around the world, he responds to leaders who trust him and respect him. That's the lesson. That's the inheritance. That's what separates the American way of war from every other military tradition. And that's what gets forgotten when we reduce Morgan to a line in a history book. Thank you for watching. If Morgan's story resonated with you, if you want to keep discovering the commanders and soldiers history forgot, I hope you'll subscribe to Unbroken Regiment and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. These stories deserve to be told. These men deserve to be remembered. And I can't do that without you. Thank you. End of Part 4, Final.